My name is Claire O'Hara. I am 40 years old, and I need you to understand something before I even get started. I am not telling you this story for sympathy. I am telling you this story because what happened in that courtroom is something that people need to hear. So let me take you back, all the way back to the beginning, because this did not start in a courtroom. This started in a mall, a shopping mall in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was 5 years old. I was holding a stuffed rabbit, and I was completely alone. My parents had walked away, not by accident, not because they got distracted. They walked away and they did not come back. I waited by the fountain. I counted the coins people threw into the water. I watched families walk past me holding hands. I sat there until a security guard found me at 9:30 at night. Nobody had called the mall. Nobody had reported a missing child. Nobody was looking for me at all. The security guard, his name was Pete. He bought me a hot dog from the food court and he sat with me while they tried to track down my parents. They found them. My mother picked up the phone on the second ring. And do you know what she said? She said, "Oh, we thought she would just find her way home." I was 5 years old. That is not a mistake. That is a decision. The state took me the same night. I went into the foster care system, and that is where I stayed for the next 3 years. 3 years of being shuffled around, sleeping in houses where I did not know anyone, eating dinner with strangers, wondering every single night what I had done wrong. And then one day, everything changed. His name was Robert O'Hara. He was 62 years old. He had made his money in commercial real estate, and he was a widower who had never had children of his own. He walked into a foster family event at a community center in Columbus, and I walked up to him and I asked him if he wanted to see my drawing. I had drawn a big house with a green yard and a yellow door. He looked at that drawing for a long time, and then he looked at me, and he said, "That is a beautiful house." And I said, "I know. I'm going to live in one someday." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere real. He started visiting me regularly after that. He brought books. He asked me questions. He actually listened to the answers. 8 months later, Robert O'Hara adopted me, and for the first time in my life, I had a real home, a real bedroom, a real dad. He was strict about education and soft about everything else. He taught me how to read a balance sheet before I was 12 and how to make his mother's lasagna before I was 10. He put me through college. He was in the front row at my law school graduation. He was the kind of man who showed up every single time. He got sick when I was 34. Pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. We had about 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I took leave from work and I was with him every single day that I could be. We talked about everything during those 14 months. He told me things about his life I had never known, and I told him things about my 5-year-old self that I had never said out loud. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in March. Quietly, with me holding his hand, he left me everything. His estate was valued at just under $8 million. His attorneys read the will 3 days after the funeral. Every single asset, every property, every investment account, all of it went to me, his only child, his daughter. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought I just had to grieve and move forward. I was wrong. About 6 weeks after the story ran on a local news segment, a human interest piece about a girl abandoned in a mall who grew up to be her adoptive father's heir, I got a letter. It was from a law firm in Cincinnati, and the names on the letterhead stopped me cold. The plaintiffs were listed as Gerald and Donna Whitfield, my biological parents. The people who left me by a fountain when I was 5 years old. They were suing me for the inheritance, $8 million. They claimed emotional damage. They claimed they had been denied the chance to raise their biological child by a flawed system. They claimed that Robert O'Hara had taken advantage of a vulnerable family in crisis. I read that letter 3 times. I set it down on my kitchen counter. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stood there, very still, and I thought about that little girl sitting by the fountain counting coins. And something shifted inside me, something quiet and completely certain. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you do not. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Sandra Klein, and she has been my colleague and my friend for over a decade. I did not panic when I called her. I did not even raise my voice. I just read her the letter over the phone, word by word, and when I finished there was a long silence on her end. Then she said, "Claire, these people have absolutely no legal standing." I said, "I know." She said, "This is going to get thrown out." I said, "I know that too." And then I said, "But I do not want it thrown out, Sandra. I want to go through the whole process. I want to sit across from them in a courtroom." She went quiet again, and then she said, "Okay, we are going to need to talk about your role in this case. Because here is the thing about me that Gerald and Donna Whitfield did not bother to find out before they filed that lawsuit. I am not just a lawyer. I had been appointed to the federal bench 8 months earlier. I was a sitting federal judge, Judge Claire O'Hara. But that is not what they called me when they filed their case. They did not do their homework. They just saw a name and a dollar amount and they called their attorney. And their attorney did not do his homework either. Because if he had, he would have pulled my full professional profile before he ever put pen to paper. He would have seen exactly who he was about to walk into a courtroom against. But he did not. And I made a very specific decision in that moment. I was not going to correct them. Not yet. I was going to let this play out exactly the way they had set it up. I hired Sandra to represent me in her official capacity. I stepped fully into the role of the plaintiff's target, the grieving daughter, the woman they thought they could intimidate into a settlement. Over the next several weeks, the legal process moved forward. Gerald and Donna's attorney, a man named Philip Hess, sent a series of aggressive letters. He used words like exploitation and systemic failure and wrongful alienation of parental rights. He painted my father Robert as a predator who had manipulated a broken family. He painted me as someone who had been poisoned against my biological roots. Every letter was more insulting than the last. Sandra responded to each one calmly and professionally. I reviewed every response. I did not insert my own tone into a single word. I was measured. I was patient. I was building something. There was a deposition. I sat across from Philip Hess in a conference room for 4 hours. He asked me questions designed to make me emotional. He asked me if I remembered my biological parents. He asked me if I had ever tried to contact him. He asked me if Robert O'Hara had ever spoken negatively about them in front of me. I answered every question honestly and directly. I did not flinch. I did not get rattled. I watched Philip Hess get more and more frustrated because I was not giving him the reaction he needed. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "Miss O'Hara, do you feel that your biological parents were treated fairly by the system that separated your family?" And I looked at him and I said, "I think the system responded appropriately to the situation that was presented to it." He wrote something down. He thought he had something. He did not have anything. My biological parents were also deposed. Sandra sent me the transcripts. I read every single page. My mother, Donna, said she had thought about me every day. She said leaving me in the mall had been the worst mistake of her life. She cried during parts of the deposition. My father, Gerald, said that Robert O'Hara had stolen his daughter and stolen his future. He said the inheritance should have come to blood family. He said, and I am quoting this directly from the transcript, "She would not even exist without us." I read that line and I set the transcript down and I walked to my kitchen window and I looked outside for a long time. She would not exist without them. That was their argument. That creating a child gave them ownership over that child's entire life and everything that child ever built or was given. That was the foundation of their $8 million claim. The court date was set for a Thursday morning in November. Philip Hess filed his final brief 2 days before the hearing. It was 41 pages long. Sandra called me after she read it and said, "This man is very confident." I said, "Yes, he is." She said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "Sandra, I need you to do something for me before we walk into that courtroom. I need you to not react to anything you see or hear in the first 5 minutes, no matter what happens." She laughed a little. She said, "Claire, what are you planning?" I did not answer her. I just said, "Trust me," and I went to bed that night more calm than I had been in months, because I already knew exactly how Thursday morning was going to go. Thursday morning came cold and clear. I wore my navy blazer. I pulled my hair back. I looked in the mirror and I thought about a 5-year-old girl sitting by a fountain in a Cincinnati mall, holding a stuffed rabbit, and I straightened my collar and I walked out the door. Sandra met me outside the courthouse at 8:15. She looked at me and she said, "You ready?" I said, "More than you know." We walked in together. The courtroom was a standard civil hearing room. Wood panels, fluorescent lights, rows of benches behind the bar. I walked in through the side entrance and I sat down at the defendant's table with my back to the gallery. Gerald and Donna were already seated at the plaintiff's table across the aisle. I did not look at them. Not yet. Philip Hess was arranging his papers. He was a tall man, good suit, the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases on intimidation alone. He had not looked up when I walked in. Sandra sat beside me, and she opened her folder, and she did not say a word. The gallery started filling up. There were a few journalists. The local news segment had given this case some attention, and people were curious. I kept my eyes forward. At 8:55, the clerk stood up and said, "All rise." And then she said the words that I had been waiting 3 months to hear out loud in that specific room. She said, "The Honorable Judge Claire O'Hara presiding." And the door to the judge's chamber opened, and I stood up from the defendant's table, and I walked through that door. I want to tell you what happened to the room in that moment, because I will never forget it as long as I live. There was a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something right in between the two. I walked up to the bench and I sat down and I looked out at the courtroom, and for the first time that morning I looked directly at the plaintiff's table. Donna had her hand over her mouth. Gerald had gone completely still. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on ice that was already cracking underneath him. Philip Hess was still standing. His file was open in his hands. He was staring at me, and his mouth was open just slightly, and the color had drained straight out of his face. I watched him try to put it together in real time. The defendant had left the defendant's table. The defendant was now sitting on the bench. The woman he had spent 3 months calling Miss O'Hara in 41 pages of aggressive legal filings was the judge assigned to hear the case. I let the silence sit for exactly long enough. Then I said, "Good morning." Philip Hess closed his mouth. He opened it again. He looked down at his papers. He looked back up at me. And then, in a voice that had lost every single bit of its earlier confidence, he said, "Good morning, Judge O'Hara." And that was it. That was the moment. My mother's face had gone pale. My father Gerald looked like he was trying to remember how to breathe. I looked at Philip Hess and I said, "Counselor, I want to be completely transparent with this court. I have no prior relationship with either party at the plaintiff's table beyond what has been established in the record of this case. I have reviewed the filings. I am prepared to hear arguments. However, I am also going to note for the record that this court takes a very serious view of cases that lack foundational legal merit and that appear designed primarily to cause distress to the opposing party." Philip Hess sat down. He did not make his big opening. He did not deliver the confident performance he had clearly rehearsed. He asked for a 30-minute recess instead. I granted it. They used that 30 minutes to call their clients into the hallway. Sandra told me later that she could hear Donna crying through the door. When we reconvened, Philip Hess stood up and said in a very quiet voice that his clients wished to withdraw the suit with prejudice. I looked at Gerald and Donna one time. One full look. They could not hold it. They both looked down at the table. I said, "Motion granted. Case dismissed." I gathered my papers. I stood up. And before I stepped down from the bench, I said, "This court is adjourned." I walked back through that side door and I stood in the hallway alone for about 30 seconds and I just breathed. Sandra found me a minute later and she hugged me without saying anything, and that was exactly right because there were no words for what that morning had been. I did not get $8 million that day. I already had it. What I got that morning was something that no amount of money ever bought for that little girl by the fountain. I got to be the one in the room who decided how the story ended, and I decided it ended with dignity. Mine.